In the heart of the Mosi Plains in Namibia, where the wind spoke in whispers through the tall grasses and the sun rained without mercy, there lived a man named Amari. To the locals and to the animals he loved, Amari wasn't just a former ranger. He was a legend. For more than 45 years, he had walked these lands, protecting the vulnerable, battling poachers, and restoring balance where chaos threatened. Now in his 70s, with a stooped back and weathered hands, Amari should have been resting, but retirement meant little to him. Each morning, as the sky barely shifted from night's blue to a dusty gold, Amari climbed into his battered green Land Rover, the paint chipped and the engine coughing like an old dog. His boots were cracked, his hat stained by decades of sweat and dust, but his spirit was as fierce as the lions he once stared down. Young rangers at the Mosi Sanctuary still sought him out, following him like ducklings, eager to hear stories and absorb his deep knowledge. Elephants, rhinos, zebras, even the aloof leopards seemed to know him, accepting his presence as part of the land itself. He paid special attention to the elderly creatures, the battered matriarchs, the solitary bulls, because he saw in their tired eyes the same fight he carried in his own bones. No matter the ache in his joints or the crackling pain in his chest, some mornings Amari refused to stop. The wild still needed him, and he would answer its call until the very end. The end, as it turned out, began on a morning that broke hotter than any before. The air was already shimmering when the first light cracked the horizon, promising a day of merciless heat. A deadly heat wave had swept across Mosi Plains, drying the watering holes into cracked mud and driving animals to cluster desperately beneath thin patches of shade. The staff warned Amari to stay back to let younger men handle the day's checks, but he shook his head stubbornly and grabbed his keys. "There's a hippo," he rasped, an old one by the lower marsh. "Hurt bad in the last storm. I need to see it with my own eyes." No one could argue with him when he spoke like that. He set out alone, the Land Rover groaning under the unrelenting sun tires, kicking up swirling dust devils behind him. Inside the cabin, it was an oven. Sweat poured down his temples, soaking his shirt, but his hands stayed firm on the wheel, steering down forgotten paths no GPS would ever find. When he reached the marsh, it was little more than a dry, cracked depression now. There, lying near a patch of yellowed reeds, was the old hippo, its massive body still its side marred by a deep gash from fallen branches. Amari parked and stepped out, shielding his eyes. Every step toward the hippo was a battle against the oppressive heat. He moved slowly, carefully, speaking in a low, soothing voice meant to comfort. The hippo lifted its massive head, weakly blinking at him. Amari's heart ached. "You're not alone, old one," he whispered, kneeling carefully into the baking dust. But even as he reached into his pack for his first aid kit, a sharp electric pain stabbed through his chest. His vision blurred. The world tilted. He gasped, clutching at his shirt, staggering backward. The tall grasses swayed in a silent, uncaring dance around him. A final thought floated through his mind like a feather caught on a dying breeze. "Luna, Keto, stay strong." And then the world fell away. From across the parched plain, two young rangers, Jonah and Zuberi, heard the faintest cry carried on the hot wind. They had been tending to a small group of distressed zebras when they froze alert. "That was Amari." Jonah barked, already sprinting toward the sound. When they reached him, Amari was crumpled in the dust, his hat fallen a few feet away, his body trembling weakly. Jonah dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse. It was there, but thready fading. "Where's his medication?" Zuberi gasped, digging through Amari's worn jacket pockets with frantic hands. "Nothing, he must have forgotten it." Jonah's voice cracked. Without wasting another second, Jonah ripped his radio from his belt. "Medical emergency, Elder down at Lower Marsh. Send transport now." Crackling static was the only reply for a gut-wrenching heartbeat before a voice answered, urgent and clear. They lifted Amari carefully onto a makeshift stretcher fashioned from canvas and poles. Sweat stung Jonah's eyes as they dragged him toward the approaching rescue vehicle. But disaster struck again. The ambulance's wheels spun uselessly in a patch of soft dust, sinking deeper with every attempt. Jonah cursed under his breath, pushing at the frame with all his strength as Zuberi floored the engine. Precious seconds slipped away like water through broken hands. Finally, with a lurch, the ambulance broke free, roaring across the cracked plains toward the sanctuary's medical building. Inside the vehicle, Jonah gripped Amari's limp hand, calling his name over and over, willing him to hold on. Zuberi drove like a man possessed, weaving dangerously through ruts and thorns. When they reached the clinic, a team of medics rushed out. They worked over him feverishly, chest compressions, oxygen masks, the sharp snap and hum of a defibrillator, the waiting room filled with other rangers silent and stunned. Time became a slow, torturous drip. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor stood up, his shoulders sagging. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "he's gone." The world seemed to tilt again, not with heat this time, but with grief. Jonah pressed a fist to his mouth to stop the cry tearing its way out of his chest. Outside, the endless Mosi plains stretched away under the merciless sun, and somewhere carried on the dry wind, it seemed like even the earth itself was mourning. The sun was sliding down the sky when the small memorial service began. News of Amari's passing had spread through the sanctuary like a dust storm, choking everyone with disbelief. The old Land Rover sat empty under the Baobab tree, dust swirling gently around its tires as if mourning too. At Jonah's insistence, they decided to honor Amari the way he would have wanted, simply in the heart of the land he had loved. Under the great Baobab tree where Amari had spent so many evenings watching the sun bleed into the earth, they laid him on a simple wooden stretcher. No polished coffin, no fanfare, only the scent of wild grasses and the endless, whispering wind. One by one, the rangers gathered, standing stiffly in a wide circle around him. Their heads were bowed, hats pressed to their chests. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant cry of a fish eagle, riding the dying light. Jonah and Zuberi stood closest, their faces hollow, their hands trembling. In his mind, Jonah could still hear Amari's voice, calm, patient, teasing him about moving too fast through the bush. Now the old man was still unnervingly still, framed by the golden fields he had given his life to protect. No speeches were made. There were no words big enough to fit inside the crater he had left behind. Only the land itself seemed to hum with mourning. They were about to lower the stretcher into a temporary resting spot when a ripple of unease swept through the gathered crowd. A low, resonant sound, a deep rumble, primal and ancient, rolled across the plains. Heads snapped up. Gasps broke the heavy air. From beyond the sea of grasses, emerging slowly with a heavy, majestic tread, came a lion, not just any lion, a massive male with a thick, dark mane streaked with silver scars. His steps were deliberate, almost solemn, and he was alone. The rangers stiffened instinctively, hands drifting toward tranquilizer guns, but Jonah raised a hand sharply. "No," he said hoarsely, "let him come." The lion padded into the circle of humans, his golden eyes unreadable but strangely calm. He paused just short of the wooden stretcher, inhaling deeply, and then astonishingly, heartbreakingly, he lowered his great head and pressed his nose gently against Amari's lifeless hand. A ripple went through the crowd. Some clutched their chests. Others turned away, tears stinging their eyes. Jonah's mind raced. And then he remembered 15 years ago he and Amari had saved a young lion caught in a vicious poacher's trap. They had tended his wounds, fed him by hand, until he regained strength. This is him," Jonah whispered aloud, voice breaking. He never forgot. The lion stayed there for a long, eternal minute, breathing in the fading scent of the man who had once granted him life. Then he circled the stretcher, once slow and reverent, before sitting heavily at the foot of it, bowing his mighty head. A gust of wind swept across the plain, stirring dust and dry leaves, and it felt somehow like the entire savannah was bowing too. As twilight thickened and the sky bruised into deeper shades of indigo, the final journey began. Jonah, Zuberi, and a handful of other rangers lifted the stretcher carefully and began the slow, solemn walk across the fields. Their destination, a wide, grassy knoll overlooking the western plains, where Amari had once said, "If I must leave, let it be here, where the world still feels wild and free." The lion, the scarred sentinel, walked with them, a silent guardian at the procession's flank. He made no sound, only kept pace, his massive shoulders rippling with each step. When they reached the chosen spot under the shade of a second, smaller baobab, they laid Amari to rest. Jonah and Zuberi dug the grave with their own hands, dirt caking their arms, their faces grim with sorrow. They placed a simple, flat stone at the head, etched hurriedly but reverently. "Amari, keeper of the wild." As they finished covering the grave, a silence fell so deep it seemed to seep into the bones of the earth. The lion stood at the edge of the newly turned soil, staring down with eyes full of something no human word could ever capture. Lost loyalty and a love as ancient as the sun-scorched plains. And then he roared. It was a roar like no other, not of challenge, not of triumph, but a long, low, broken sound, vibrating through the ground, carrying grief up into the darkening sky. The rangers bowed their heads again, tears flowing freely now. One by one they drifted away, leaving Jonah and Zuberi alone to give their final silent goodbyes. They stood there until the first stars began to prick the heavens, until the lion finally lay down beside the mound of earth, his massive body curling protectively around it. Jonah turned to leave, his heart feeling both crushed and uplifted all at once. Behind him, silhouetted against the rising moon, the lion kept vigil, a lone, unbreakable sentinel over the man who had once saved him, and whom he would now protect in death. The legend of Amari had not ended. It had simply changed forms, carried now in the roar of the wild and in the quiet, endless loyalty of a king who remembered. Morning broke slowly over Mosi plains, casting long, tired shadows across the golden grass. In the early hush, the sanctuary staff returned to the grave, not as workers, not as rangers, but simply as mourning souls drawn by something older than duty. The lion was still there. He had not moved. He lay curled against the small mound of earth, as if trying to shield it from the world. When Jonah and Zuberi approached quietly, the great beast lifted his head slowly. He looked at them, not with the sharp, suspicious gaze of a predator, but with something ancient and grieving, something human in its depth. Then without a sound, he rose to his feet. As the rangers gathered carrying wreaths of wildflowers picked from the edges of the reserve, the lion walked alongside them. He moved slowly, almost reverently, each step heavy with meaning. Together they circled the grave. Together they honored the man who had bound them, all human and beast, into something greater than themselves. When the last flower was placed, Jonah stepped forward. His voice was raw but steady, as he spoke to the grave, to the lion, and to the wide-open sky. "You kept your promise, old man. You watched over us all. Now we'll watch over this land for you." The lion stood beside him, silent and still. In the days that followed, something extraordinary unfolded. Each evening, as the last light bled out of the horizon, the lion returned to the grave. Sometimes he simply sat, a golden sentinel beneath the indigo sky. Sometimes he laid down his head, resting gently against the cool stones. The rangers, at first wary, soon realized they had no reason to fear. The lion had no interest in violence, only remembrance. Tourists who passed through the sanctuary in those weeks were struck silent at the sight. The story of Amari and the lion spread like wildfire, whispered from jeep to jeep, told in hushed, reverent tones over campfires. Children clutched at their parents' hands when they saw the lion lying there, unmoving, guarding. Elderly visitors wept openly, touched by a loyalty so raw, it defied reason. Jonah and Zuberi visited often too. They would sit near the grave, sharing quiet conversations with the breeze, telling Amari about the day's patrols, about the calf rescued from a snare, about the small victories they still fought for in his name. Sometimes they brought offerings, a hand-carved walking stick, a worn ranger's hat, tokens of a life well lived, and always the lion was there. Seasons shifted gently over Mosi plains. Rains came and went, grasses greened and withered, herds moved like ancient rivers across the horizon. But the story never faded. Locals spoke of Amari with a reverence reserved for the great chiefs of old. Not because of the battles he fought, but because of the lives he touched, because in a world that often forgot kindness, Amari had made it his life's work. At the sanctuary's entrance, they raised a modest stone memorial, Amari the Last Guardian. His spirit roams the plains. Sometimes at dusk, when the light bent strange and golden, visitors swore they could hear a low rumble rolling across the fields, the echo of a lion's mournful roar, a sound not of fear but of memory. And sometimes, if you look carefully along the western knoll, where the Baobab stood sentinel, you might see a great scarred lion resting under its shade, his mane lifted gently by the eternal winds, still watching, still guarding, still remembering. Because true bonds, the ones forged not by blood but by spirit, never truly break. They become part of the earth, part of the sky, part of the endless songs sung by the wild. Amari was gone, but he had not left. He lived on in the roar of the lion, in the hearts of the ones he had saved, and in the boundless, everlasting breath of Mosi plains. Forever.